The scream shattered the jungle silence. A woman's voice, sharp, terrified, echoed across the clearing, followed by the harsh command of an American Marine. "Hold her! She's hiding something!" Natsumi's feet skidded in the mud as two soldiers pulled her forward. Her hair clung to her face, rainwater dripping down her cheeks like sweat or tears. No one could tell. The jungle around them steamed after the morning rain, every leaf trembling as if holding its breath for what came next. Her hands clutched her chest, instinct, fear, desperation. But to the Marines, conditioned by months of booby traps hidden in clothing, it looked like something else, something deadly. "Don't let her trigger it," the sergeant barked. Before she could speak, before she could even inhale, one soldier, Private Daniel Smith, lunged toward her. His boots splashed into the mud, momentum ripping through the air. And in one violent motion, he tore her shirt open. Her scream cut the clearing a second time, and then abruptly died. Silence fell so quickly, it was unnerving. Even the dripping leaves seemed to stop. Something small, wrapped in a scrap of faded cloth, slid out from inside her clothing and landed between them with a soft, almost delicate thud. It wasn't metal. It wasn't a grenade. It wasn't a fuse. It was something else. The sergeant, breathing hard, knelt and picked it up carefully. Mud smeared across the cloth as he unwrapped it. The Marines leaned in, weapons trembling in their hands. A tiny wooden rabbit lay inside. Old, hand-carved, the paint nearly gone, the ears chipped, the body smooth from years of being held. Natsumi gasped, not in fear of the Marines, but for the toy. She dropped to her knees, bowing deeply, forehead nearly touching the mud. Her hands pressed flat in front of her, trembling. It was an apology, a plea, a desperate attempt to protect whatever memory that little rabbit carried. "Sir," Smith whispered, voice cracking. I thought," but the sentence died in his throat. The sergeant signaled to a corporal. "Get Sato. Now." A moment later, a Japanese-American interpreter, Corporal Ken Sato, hurried over. His boots squelched in the mud as he dropped to one knee beside the sergeant. The sergeant placed the wooden rabbit in front of him. "What is it?" Sato glanced at Natsumi, then at the toy. "It's a child's charm. Something a mother gives her son." The Marines fell silent again. The tension in the clearing shifted, no longer fear, but something sharper. Guilt, misunderstanding, a realization of what they'd just done. Natsumi still bowed, shoulders shaking faintly. She was waiting for punishment, waiting for humiliation to get worse, waiting for another blow she had seen others take. But then something impossible happened. Smith stepped forward slowly. His breath trembled. His hands shook, not with adrenaline now, but with remorse. Rainwater slid down his helmet and dripped onto the torn edges of Natsumi's shirt. He removed his own jacket. Not a military order. Not protocol. A choice. Kneeling in the mud, he draped the jacket gently over her shoulders, pulling the fabric closed so she would not be exposed. The motion was careful, almost fragile, completely out of place in the brutality of the Pacific War. Then, with the toy lying between them like evidence of his mistake, Smith bowed. 90 degrees, hands at his sides, forehead angled toward the ground. A bow of apology. A bow no Marine had ever given a Japanese civilian. The other Marines froze. Even Sato's mouth parted slightly, stunned. Natsumi lifted her head just enough to see him, and her breath stopped. Her screams went silent, in shock. No American soldier had ever bowed to her people. Not once. Not for anything. And now this man, this young Marine who had humiliated her only seconds earlier, was kneeling before her in the mud, offering a gesture she had never imagined she would see. She stared, unable to move, unable to understand the world that suddenly shifted under her. The sergeant cleared his throat quietly. "Pack up. We move." But Smith didn't rise immediately. He waited, kneeling, head still lowered, until Natsumi slowly reached out, lifted the wooden rabbit from the mud, and clutched it to her chest. Only then did he stand. The column began to form around them. Rain thickened again, pattering on helmets and leaves. The jungle seemed to exhale, recovering from the moment of suspended disbelief. As the Marines prepared to march, Smith glanced at Natsumi one more time, unsure whether he'd done enough, unsure whether anything could undo what had passed between them. She didn't look away, but her expression was unreadable. And then, somewhere deeper in the jungle, a distant echo rolled through the trees. Not thunder, not artillery. Something else was moving. Rain softened into mist as the Marines began to move again. Natsumi walked with the civilians they had gathered earlier, Smith a few steps behind her, his eyes fixed on the back of his own jacket now draped around her shoulders. The fabric looked far too large on her, almost swallowing her frame, but she held it closed with both hands, gripping the wooden rabbit underneath as if it were the last solid thing in her world. The narrator's voice entered softly, a calm contrast to the dripping jungle. To understand why her screams fell silent, we must go back. Before the caves, before the escape, before the island swallowed her family whole. The jungle dissolved into memory. Natsumi stood outside a small wooden house on the outskirts of Nagasaki. The air smelled of warm rice and sea salt. Her young son, Taichi, no more than 6, laughed as he chased a wooden rabbit along the veranda. The same rabbit now hidden in Smith's jacket. Her husband had carved it in the last winter before he was conscripted. "Something for him to hold," he had said. "Something to remind him I'm coming home." Taichi slept with it every night. Natsumi held it every morning after he left for school. Then the air raid sirens changed everything. One morning became smoke. Homes collapsed. Bodies were carried through the streets wrapped in blankets. Taichi never came home from school. Only the wooden rabbit was found in the rubble. She pressed it to her chest and promised him, "I will carry this for both of us, until the day I see you again, somewhere." When the Allied forces advanced and civilians fled into the caves, she hid the rabbit inside her clothing. It was the only possession she kept when everything else, home, husband, son, was lost to fire and echoes. And so, when Smith tore open her shirt, he had torn open more than fabric. He had torn open the last memory she had left. The jungle returned as the Marines continued their slow march. The column moved through uneven ground, the air thick with humidity. Some soldiers whispered about the apology they'd witnessed. Others avoided looking in Natsumi's direction. Smith walked stiffly, replaying the moment over and over, the rip, the scream, the rabbit falling. His stomach twisted each time the memory surfaced. Sato, the interpreter, eventually fell back to walk beside him. "You surprised them," he murmured. Smith swallowed. "Did she understand?" Sato nodded. "She understood perfectly. A bow like that, it's not small." They marched in silence for a while. Roots twisted along the ground like old scars. The jungle thinned, leading them toward a ridge path. That was where they found the first bodies. 3 civilians, 2 adults, 1 elderly man. Starvation. Exhaustion. The slow death of those trapped between armies. The Marines fell quiet. Even the ones hardened by combat lowered their eyes. Natsumi stopped walking when she saw them. Her breath hitched, but she didn't cry. She simply bowed her head, whispering something Smith couldn't hear. The march continued. An hour later, They stumbled onto life instead of death, a small group of survivors emerging from behind a mossy boulder, a woman clutching a child, two men limping, a teenage boy with a bandaged leg, soaked through with blood. When the woman recognized Natsumi, she rushed toward her, collapsing into her arms with a cry. The Marines raised their rifles on instinct, but Natsumi raised one trembling hand. "Please," she whispered. "They are not soldiers." Sato translated. The sergeant lowered his weapon first. Then they heard it. A soft hiss. A thin crack. Barely louder than a branch snapping. But Smith knew the sound instantly. A rifle round slicing through leaves. "Sniper! Down!" he yelled. Chaos erupted. Marines dove behind rocks and tree trunks. The civilians screamed, shielding the wounded boy. Rain exploded upward from mud as rounds struck near their feet. Natsumi froze. Just one heartbeat too long. Smith didn't think. He lunged. His shoulder slammed into hers, knocking her flat behind a fallen log just as a bullet tore through the air where her head had been. She hit the ground hard, breath knocked from her lungs. The wooden rabbit almost slipped from her grip. Smith hovered over her, shielding her with his own body as another shot cracked from the ridge. "Stay down!" he hissed, eyes scanning for the shooter. Natsumi stared up at him, confused, terrified, and overwhelmed by a second shock she hadn't been prepared for. The man who had torn her clothing hours ago was now risking his life to protect her. The sergeant crawled through the mud. "Find the shooter! Hold position!" But Smith wasn't listening anymore. He'd seen movement in the trees. A glint. A muzzle shifting. A silhouette lining up another shot, this time aimed lower. Aimed at the group of survivors. Smith's breath caught. He recognized the pattern. The angle. The intent. This wasn't just an ambush. It was someone else's hunt. And the next bullet wasn't meant for a soldier. The truck rumbled through the final stretch of muddy road and emerged into a clearing. The forest thinned suddenly, replaced by rows of wooden barracks, a perimeter fence, and the stark geometry of an American POW camp. The sign hung just above the gate. Camp Redleaf, Civilian Holding Zone. The convoy slowed. Engines grumbled. The air smelled of wet canvas, diesel, and distant wood smoke. Natsumi lifted her head. For the first time in days, the world was not green, not claustrophobic, not hiding rifles or shadows. Instead, she saw order, structure, men in clean uniforms, lines of laundry flapping behind barracks, a faint clang of pots from a kitchen tent. But she also saw fear, faces peering out through gaps in wooden walls. Women, the elderly, a boy barely 10 years old clutching a tin bowl. The truck stopped. A sergeant opened the tailgate and gestured. Everyone out. Slowly. The civilians descended one by one, stiff from the ride. The wounded teenage boy was carried out on a stretcher toward the medical tent. His mother followed, whispering silent prayers. The older men leaned heavily on each other. Natsumi stepped down last. Smith was already on the ground, rifle slung but posture uneasy, unsure whether to look at her or away. She still wore his jacket, soaked but warm, and the wooden rabbit remained hidden beneath it. She didn't speak to him, but she didn't avoid him either. A Redleaf officer walked toward them with a clipboard. Names, ages, place of origin. We'll process them through the intake shed. Sato translated softly, guiding the civilians forward. Natsumi followed, each step slow, deliberate. The intake shed was little more than a wooden hut with 2 tables, one for paperwork, one for medical checks. A nurse examined her briefly. Blood pressure, temperature, a check for injuries. "You're dehydrated," he murmured. Sato translated. Natsumi nodded faintly. Then came the moment she feared. "Any personal items to declare?" She hesitated, hands tightening on the jacket. The nurse waited patiently. Natsumi shook her head. The wooden rabbit stayed hidden. When the intake ended, she was escorted to the women's barracks, Barrack 9. It smelled of damp straw and boiled rice. Inside, a handful of women sat against the walls. Their faces were tired, hollowed by weeks or months of displacement. One woman lifted her gaze, a thin mother in her 30s, eyes red from lack of sleep. Beside her sat an empty blanket, folded with care. A child's blanket. Natsumi froze when she saw it. The woman noticed. "You lost someone too?" She whispered in Japanese. Natsumi swallowed. "My son." The woman nodded, tears streaking quietly. "Mine, 1 month ago." No screams. No dramatic collapse. Just two mothers exchanging grief like a single language no one else understood. Across the room, a boy of 19 sat hunched on a bench. His hands trembled so violently he couldn't keep a tin cup steady. Water spilled onto his knees. He muttered apologies under his breath, apologies to no one in particular. He saw his brother die, an older prisoner murmured. Hasn't spoken since. At the far corner, an elderly man with white eyebrows carved small shapes into a piece of driftwood using a dull pocket knife. A bird, a boat, a flower. His movements were slow but patient, the hands of someone who had once built furniture, perhaps toys, before the war devoured his life. He looked up at Natsumi and offered a tiny smile. Warm, despite everything. She lowered her gaze, overwhelmed by the weight of so many shattered stories. For a moment, she forgot the Marines, the sniper, even Smith's apology. She saw only the echo of her own pain reflected in others. Outside, the camp bell rang, metallic, sharp. Evening rations. The prisoners lined up quietly. Rice thinned with water. A ladle of soup that smelled of onions and little else. Natsumi sat with the others, eating slowly, feeling the warmth seep into her empty stomach. Across the yard, beyond the fence, the soldiers' area glowed with lantern light. Laughter, boots clattering, the mundane sounds of men who were not starving, not grieving. Smith stood near the guard tower, rifle slung, eyes distant. He watched the POW yard without truly seeing it, lost in the memory of tearing her shirt, of bowing in the mud, of diving in front of the bullet. His guilt clung to him like a second uniform. A fellow Marine slapped his shoulder. "You look like hell, Smith." "Didn't sleep," he muttered. "You never sleep." "Yeah." Later, in the barracks for soldiers, Smith sat at a small desk with a sheet of paper. He wrote slowly, "Mother, today I..." He stopped, stared, tore the page in half, crumpled it. Tried again. "I made a mistake, a bad one, and I don't know how to fix it." He dropped the pencil, head in his hands. Through the open flap of the tent, he could see the faint outline of Barrack 9. A single figure sat near the doorway, knees to her chest, jacket drawn around her, wooden rabbit pressed to her chin. Natsumi. Smith looked away quickly, but not before something inside him tightened. Not attraction. Not sympathy. Something heavier. Responsibility. And with the camp silent except for distant thunder, he knew the real burden of his mistake was only beginning. Morning in Camp Redleaf began with the clang of a metal bell and the low rumble of boots crossing gravel. Thin sunlight filtered through patchy clouds, casting pale beams over the POW yard. The air was cool, almost gentle, nothing like the humid thickness of the jungle Natsumi had escaped. But gentleness didn't equal comfort. Natsumi stood in line for breakfast, clutching her tin bowl. A thin stream of rice porridge slid into it with a soft splash. Around her, murmurs floated in soft Japanese, women sharing scraps of memory, men counting days since their capture, children trying to stay quiet so their mothers wouldn't be scolded for noise. After the meal, a guard called out, "English class, Barrack 5, civilians only." Sato translated, and there was a small stir. Some prisoners hesitated. Others seemed grateful for anything that resembled structure. Natsumi followed the group toward a long wooden barrack with windows propped open by sticks. Inside, benches were arranged in crooked rows. A chalkboard leaned against the wall, its edges dented. A young American private stood beside it holding a piece of chalk like it was a foreign object. He looked nervous, more nervous than the prisoners. When the class settled, he cleared his throat. "My name, Private Brooks. We learn simple English." Sato stood beside him as interpreter. Brooks wrote the first word on the board. Water. The room shifted with quiet confusion. The boy who trembled the night before stared at the chalk strokes like they were moving on their own. The elderly woodcarver squinted hard, trying to memorize the shape. Natsumi tried repeating the word silently. Water. Her lips formed the sound, but it felt thick, unfamiliar. She had studied basic English in school, nothing like this. Brooks continued with simple phrases. Yes. No. Help. Food. Each word carried weight. Each one was a reminder of where they were and why learning might matter. Halfway through the lesson, the mother with the empty blanket tried to repeat a phrase. Her voice cracked. The room fell silent as tears slipped down her cheeks, dripping onto the folded cloth. She clutched it tightly, whispering her son's name. The trembling boy flinched at the sound and dropped his pencil. It clattered loudly against the floor, and he covered his ears, rocking slightly. Brooks froze, unsure what to do. Sato knelt beside the woman, speaking gently. Another prisoner placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, grounding him. Natsumi watched all of it quietly, absorbing every wound in the room. It reminded her of hospital tents before Nagasaki fell, when she served as a military nurse. Grief had colors then, smells, temperatures. Here, in red leaf, it was quieter but no less sharp. The elderly woodcarver broke the tension by holding up his half-finished carving, a small bird. For her, he murmured in Japanese, nodding toward the mother. A gift in the middle of loss. Brooks didn't understand the words, but understood the gesture. He smiled awkwardly, relieved. When the lesson ended, the prisoners filed out into the yard. Some practiced the English words under their breath. Some walked silently. The woman held the carved bird and bowed to the old man. Natsumi stepped into the sunlight, the jacket still around her shoulders, the wooden rabbit hidden beneath. Every sound, every face in the camp painted a clearer picture of where she was and why survival wasn't only about food and shelter. It was about navigating grief in a place full of it. Across the yard, near the guard tower, Smith stood watch. He didn't approach her, didn't call out, didn't even move when she glanced in his direction. But he saw her, saw the stiffness in her shoulders, saw the way she touched the jacket collar, saw the wooden shape beneath the fabric when the wind shifted. He gripped the railing of the tower tightly, knuckles whitening. There were 100 things he wanted to say, none of them permitted by uniform or rank. So he stayed where he was, letting the weight of his guilt settle deeper. Natsumi turned away first. She walked back toward Barrack 9, steps slow, the lesson's English words echoing faintly in her mind. Help, food, water, and one word she couldn't say yet, not to him, not to anyone. Why? Camp Redleaf woke slowly each morning, as if the war outside had pushed all strength out of the place. The bell clanged at dawn. Guards walked the fence line. Prisoners lined up for a ladle of rice porridge. The rhythms repeated, identical and muted, as if time had been pared down to only necessities. Food, sleep, survival. For Natsumi, the first days in the camp felt like wading through fog. She spoke little, moved quietly, and kept Smith's jacket wrapped around her shoulders. At night she held the wooden rabbit under the fabric and whispered her son's name, Taichi, over and over, each syllable a memory and a wound. In the mornings, she helped in the medical tent beside the corpsman, Miller. He wasn't much older than Smith, 23, perhaps, but his hands were steady and his voice carried patience. He noticed the way Natsumi examined the wounded boy's leg, calm, precise, so he asked her, through Sato, "You were trained as a nurse?" Natsumi hesitated, but nodded. Miller smiled faintly. "Good. I need help." So she helped, quietly, competently. She tied bandages, cleaned cuts, soothed frightened civilians. With each task, a piece of who she had been before the firestorms of Nagasaki slipped back into her bones, the woman who had dedicated her life to saving others, not running from explosions or crouching in caves. Fumio, the mother with the empty blanket, visited often. Sometimes she sat in silence. Sometimes she poured out memories of her son until her voice cracked. Each time, Natsumi stayed near, not speaking much, just offering the presence she wished someone had given her when Taichi disappeared beneath the rubble. The elderly woodcarver drifted in and out as well. He always carried a small carving, unfinished, for someone else in the camp. "For the trembling boy," he would say. "For the old woman who can't sleep. For the girl who cries at night." And with each gift, a piece of hope seeped back into Redleaf's air. Beyond the fence, soldiers lived a different life. Smith spent his days patrolling the perimeters and his nights failing to sleep. The memory of the clearing, her scream, his hands tearing fabric, the rabbit falling, looped through his mind without mercy. He tried to write letters home. Each one ended shredded on the floor. A fellow Marine nudged him one evening. "You look like you're seeing ghosts, Smith." "Maybe I am." When he stood watch in the tower, he often saw Natsumi in the yard, helping Miller, sitting with Fumio, watching the carved animals the old man shaped. She didn't look toward him often, and when she did, her gaze was unreadable. Not hatred, but not forgiveness either. Smith didn't know what to do with that. One afternoon, English class resumed in Barrack 5. Natsumi walked in with the others, settling on a bench near the middle. Private Brooks looked slightly more comfortable than the first day, but still clutched the chalk like it might explode. He wrote new words on the board. Family. Home. Peace. The trembling boy's hands shook when he tried writing family. Fumio whispered the word under her breath, tears forming. The woodcarver traced the letters slowly, as if sculpting them into his mind. Natsumi repeated them silently. Family. Home. Peace. Each word tugged her memories painfully. Near the end of the lesson, Brooks dropped his chalk. It rolled toward Natsumi's feet. She picked it up and handed it back gently. For a brief second, their eyes met, student and teacher, enemy and civilian, two people caught in a war neither asked for. Brooks swallowed and whispered, "Thank you," almost too quietly for anyone else to hear. Evening fell with a long breath of cool air. Lanterns flickered along the fence, casting golden light over the yard. Prisoners gathered in small groups, sharing bowls of thin soup, humming songs from the places they had lost, Natsumi stepped outside Barrack 9 and gazed across the yard. Smith was at the tower again, leaning on the railing, posture weary. The lantern light caught the lines of exhaustion on his face. He looked less like a guard and more like a man trapped in a different kind of prison, one made of guilt. She didn't know why she kept looking for him. Habit? Curiosity? Confusion? Maybe because kindness from someone she once feared felt more destabilizing than cruelty ever had. Before she could think further, the distant rumble of an approaching vehicle rolled across the ground. Not American supply trucks. Not artillery. Something else. Something carrying people. New prisoners. Natsumi felt a chill crawl up her spine. Redleaf's quiet days were about to change. The truck that rolled into Camp Redleaf carried exhaustion like a physical weight. The moment the rear doors opened, prisoners and guards alike tensed, not from fear, but from recognition. The people who stepped out were not just displaced. They were broken in ways the camp had not yet witnessed. They came from Okinawa, a boy with a splinted arm, a young mother whose eyes stared through everything, a man limping, face bruised, clothes burned, and an elderly woman carried by two others, her kimono shredded, her breath shallow. The corpsman rushed forward, and Natsumi followed without being asked. She helped guide the wounded to the medical tent, cleaning cuts, pressing cloth to burns, whispering soft words that steadied shaking hands. But when she reached the elderly woman, the woman's fingers tightened suddenly around Natsumi's wrist. "Are you from the mainland?" the woman rasped. Natsumi nodded. The old woman leaned closer, eyes burning with something darker than fear. "They didn't tell you the truth," she whispered. Natsumi froze. "Who?" "Our soldiers." The words were jagged, like a blade scraping old wounds. "They told us the Americans would torture us, kill us. So mothers, children, everyone, we jumped from the cliffs." Her voice cracked. "But it was a lie. They wanted us gone so they could retreat. They left the injured, left families, used civilians as shields." Natsumi's breath stilled. The woman gripped harder. "Your country's army did this. Not the Americans. Not this camp. Not the men guarding these fences." The words hit Natsumi like a blow. Her mind scrambled, images of propaganda posters, officers shouting instructions, civilians shoved into caves, the fear of being captured by Americans. All of it felt suddenly unstable, like a story told too many times until no one remembered which parts were real. The woman's strength faded, and she slumped back onto the stretcher. Miller took over, but Natsumi didn't move. Her knees felt weak, her chest hollow. If everything she believed about Americans was wrong, then what else had been a lie? Had she run from the wrong enemy her whole life? Later, as dusk settled, Natsumi stepped out of the medical tent. The camp was quiet, too quiet. Lanterns burned low. Prisoners murmured softly in little knots, trying to understand the new arrivals' stories. Natsumi walked toward Barrack 9 slowly, each step weighed down by thoughts she couldn't untangle. She paused halfway across the yard. At the watchtower, Smith stood still, gazing over the camp with a look she couldn't read, exhaustion, guilt, something heavy. She remembered the bow, the jacket around her shoulders, the way he had shielded her from the sniper, the quiet regret in his eyes every time he saw her. She had feared him once. She had hated him because she thought she was supposed to. But after what the Okinawan woman said, who was the real enemy? Smith looked down at the same moment. Their eyes met across the yard, not in anger, not in fear, but in something new. Recognition, complexity, humanity. The world was not what she had been told. and neither was he. The announcement came without warning, carried into the yard by a young corporal clutching a clipboard too tightly. Prisoners looked up from their morning rations as he cleared his throat and began reading names. Some gasped. Some went rigid. For weeks they had lived in suspended existence, neither free nor condemned, waiting for a word that might never come. When the corporal reached the final name, his voice softened almost imperceptibly. Natsumi Kawahara. She didn't stand immediately. The name felt like it belonged to a version of herself she had buried somewhere in Redleaf's dust. But Sato touched her arm gently, nodding with a small, reassuring smile. "It's you," he said. "You can go home." Home. A word with weight and no shape. A memory, perhaps, but which one? From the watchtower, Smith stood at full height the moment he heard her name. He didn't react outwardly. Marines weren't trained to flinch. But his fingers tightened around the railing until the knuckles blanched. He watched her gather her few belongings, Miller's extra cloth bandage, the wooden rabbit, the jacket he'd given her, and walk slowly toward the gate. He wanted to call her name, to apologize again, to say something more than silence. But soldiers didn't get goodbyes. He bowed his head instead, unseen. The truck engine rumbled. Dust billowed, and Natsumi disappeared behind its wooden slats. The road to Nagasaki wound through a landscape that hardly felt like Japan anymore. Villages flattened by air raids, rice fields brown to ash, rivers clogged with ruined timbers. The truck bounced along potholes carved by months of military traffic. Every so often, Natsumi felt her stomach tighten, not from the jolt, but from the thought that each mile pulled her closer to a truth she feared more than captivity. Around her sat other repatriated civilians. Sevens, a widower gripping a cloth pouch. Sevens, a mother with a baby too quiet. Sevens, a teenage boy staring at his shoes as if ashamed to be carrying them home. No one spoke. Grief had a way of sealing mouths. Hours later, they reached a processing camp just outside Nagasaki. A clerk interviewed her with clinical formality: name, age, former address, next of kin. When she mentioned her son, the clerk paused, his face shifting sadly. "You may not find clear records," he said carefully. Many families were caught in the open. He meant to be gentle, but the words struck like a blade. Natsumi bowed and continued on foot, following signs toward the city center. Nagasaki no longer resembled any memory she held. Where narrow streets once wound between wooden homes, there were now vast, open plains of debris. Blackened chimneys jutted like broken teeth. Metal structures twisted into impossible shapes. The air smelled of ash even months later, as if the sky itself hadn't finished grieving. She stepped over fractured roof tiles, past a well she recognized only by the stone pattern, past the spot where Taichi once watched fireflies. Her breath caught when she reached the place that used to be her home. Nothing remained. The outline of the house was visible only by the discolored earth, a rectangle of soot and scattered fragments. A bent spoon, a scorched sandal, and half a ceramic bowl buried face down as if someone had placed it gently there before the world ended. Natsumi knelt. Her fingers brushed the soil. A sound escaped her, a small, broken exhale that was neither a sob nor a breath. Something between. A woman from the relief station approached slowly, careful not to startle her. "Are you searching for someone?" "My son," Natsumi whispered, voice trembling for the first time in months. The woman hesitated. "There was a school nearby," she said. "Many children were outside when the blast came." Natsumi closed her eyes. "They didn't suffer," the woman added softly. The words fell like ash around her. Natsumi bowed her head to the earth, palms pressed into the dirt where Taichi once played. No tears came. Grief had hollowed her too deeply for tears. She stayed like that for a long time, until her knees ached and her hands shook. When she finally stood, the sky over Nagasaki had shifted to deep orange, the color of endings. And Natsumi felt something inside her loosen, not in relief, in surrender. The truth she feared had found her. Her son was gone. Her home was gone. And she remained. Night descended over Nagasaki with a hush so deep it felt unreal. No marketplace chatter. No temple bells. Just the faint rustle of wind moving through skeletal ruins. Natsumi walked without direction, letting her feet choose what her mind could not. Smith's jacket felt heavier now, soaked with memories she had carried across an ocean of loss. She reached the harbor again, the same wooden pier where fishermen once laughed, where Taichi once begged her to buy sweet buns on the way home. Now it was a splintered outline. The sea beneath it whispered against the beams, dark and endless. Natsumi stopped at the edge. Grief pressed against her chest, so dense it felt like her lungs had shrunk. She rested her hands on the railing. The wood was cool, smooth in some places, jagged in others, like a timeline broken in half. If she leaned forward, the water would accept her without judgment. A single, dangerous thought flickered. If I leave, the pain will leave, too. Her breathing hitched. The world narrowed until all she saw was black water and the reflection of a woman she no longer recognized. And then, unbidden, a different image surfaced in her mind. A jungle clearing. Her scream tearing the air. Smith's hands ripping fabric. The wooden rabbit falling. And then, Smith bowing. A full, shattering bow, spine bent, breath unsteady, as if he wished he could fold himself smaller than his shame. His voice, shaking. I'm sorry. The memory struck her harder than the waves. Why that moment? Why now? Perhaps because it was the first time since the war began that someone had offered her dignity instead of trying to take it. Perhaps because his bow told her something he had no words for. Pain shared is lighter than pain carried alone. Her fingers loosened. Her knees buckled. She sank onto the pier and covered her face with both hands, not to cry but to breathe, to prove she still could. Minutes passed. Or hours. Time folded strangely around grief. When she finally lifted her head, the horizon had lightened with the first shades of dawn. Not warm, not hopeful, but present, alive in a way she hadn't felt in months. Her whisper drifted over the tide. Live. Not a command. Not a promise. A beginning. The relief station sat inside an old school building that had miraculously survived with only cracked walls and a scorched roof. Volunteers moved through the courtyard with crates of donated supplies. Clothes, rice, blankets, small toys carved by local craftsmen. Children filled the yard, barefoot, hollow-eyed, clutching fragments of their former lives. Some stared at Natsumi as she walked in, cautious and tired. Others ignored her, lost in grief too deep for curiosity. A young volunteer approached. Are you here to register for assistance? Natsumi shook her head. I came to help. The volunteer blinked, startled. We need help. A lot. He hesitated, eyes scanning her tired face. You don't have to push yourself. Natsumi bowed slightly. I must, she said. It's the only thing left I know how to do. He nodded and led her inside. Her first task was simple. Comfort a crying child. A toddler sat alone in the corner, cheeks streaked with soot, fists clenching a torn cloth doll. Every time someone approached, he flinched, then wailed as if expecting pain. Natsumi knelt several feet away and waited, saying nothing, moving slowly. Minutes passed before the boy peeked at her through swollen eyes. She extended her hand, palm up. No pressure, no demand. Eventually, he inched forward, collapsed into her lap, and wept until exhaustion claimed him. Natsumi held him without speaking, her heart tightening at the familiar weight of a child's small frame. Another volunteer passed by. "He's been crying for days," he whispered. "Can you sit with him a little longer?" She nodded. And she did. For hours. In the afternoon, she helped sort supplies. In the evening, she checked the fevers of 2 siblings. She changed linens, distributed food bowls, and guided a frightened girl away from the broken window she kept trying to crawl through. Each act tugged at wounds inside her, and each act stitched something, too. Near sunset, a boy approached, no older than 7. He held out a charred wooden block, the same one she had seen him clinging to the day before. "It's all I have," he murmured. Natsumi bowed, accepting the object with both hands. "It still matters," she said gently. His eyes widened, not with relief, but with recognition. Someone had seen his grief without turning away. He returned the bow, clumsy, too deep, and ran off to join the other children. When night settled, Natsumi sat beneath the old schoolyard tree, exhausted to the bone, but steady in a way she hadn't felt since the day before the flash. She looked at the dim windows glowing with warm light. Children sleeping. Children safe. For the first time since losing Taichi, she understood something quietly profound. 7's purpose did not erase pain, but it gave pain somewhere to go, somewhere to transform, somewhere to heal. The river breeze brushed against her cheek, cool, calming, carrying faint scents of spring. Natsumi closed her eyes. Tomorrow she would return, and the next day, and the next. Because saving one child would never bring Taichi back, but saving many might honor him. Spring settled slowly over Nagasaki. Roofs were repaired. Streets cleared. Markets reopened in hesitant whispers. But the relief station, where Natsumi spent every waking hour, was always full. Too many children. Too few adults. Too much grief compressed into small bodies no child should have to carry. Weeks became months, and the station began to feel less like a place of emergency and more like a place of becoming. One morning, the volunteer leader approached her with a folder pressed to his chest. "They're assigning children to long-term care," he said. "Some families will take in orphans, but many won't." Natsumi looked at the courtyard, tiny shoes left outside the door, laundry flapping from broken railings, children chasing each other between chalk drawings on cracked concrete. "They need permanence," she murmured. "They need you," he replied quietly. The folder in his hands contained the first list of children who had nowhere else to go. At the top was the boy who'd offered her the charred wooden block. Beneath him, Hana, the girl who never spoke above a whisper. And beside them, 9 more names. 12 children. 12 lives. She closed the folder, hands trembling. "If I take them," she whispered, "I must take all of them. You don't have to carry that alone." Natsumi shook her head. "No, but I can begin." Within a year, the school building was officially converted. A new sign hung above the door. 7's Kawahara Home for Children, founded 1947. People donated clothes. A carpenter rebuilt the kitchen. A local teacher volunteered to teach reading. Natsumi slept little, worked constantly, and learned each child's quiet fears. 7's. Hana feared thunder. The boy with the wooden block refused to sleep unless he could see the sky. One girl hid food beneath her pillow. Another panicked at the sound of airplanes. Natsumi met each fear with patience, the same way she once tended wounded soldiers, slow, steady, believing healing could only happen when someone stayed long enough. Years moved in steady circles. Children arrived. Children grew. Children left with new names, new futures. But the sign above the door never changed. 4 decades passed. Nagasaki had risen again, bright, crowded, humming with life. The orphanage, now painted pale blue, housed fewer children but remained a refuge known throughout the region. Alumni visited often. Some brought their own children. Some brought flowers. All bowed to the woman who raised them. One autumn afternoon, a staff member hurried into the office. "There's an American veteran asking for you," she said. "He's part of some reconciliation program. Says he served in the Pacific." Natsumi's pen froze mid-stroke. American, Pacific. A pulse of old memory stirred, jungle rain, a falling wooden rabbit, a bowed apology. She stood slowly. Outside, by the stone path lined with hydrangeas, an elderly man waited. Tall but stooped, weathered hands gripping a hat. Eyes uncertain, searching the doorway as if afraid of what he might find. When she stepped into view, he inhaled sharply. A small, astonished sound, half laugh, half breath, escaped him. "Natsumi," he whispered. The years fell away, leaving only the two people who once stood in a clearing neither had forgotten. She nodded once, not as the frightened woman he'd wronged, nor as the soldier he'd failed, but as the life that came after. He bowed. Slowly, deeply, the same bow he'd given her 40 years before. This time, she returned it. The hydrangeas rustled gently as a breeze swept through the orphanage yard. For a moment, neither of them moved. Smith stood framed against the late afternoon sun, shoulders bent not only from age, but from everything he had carried for 40 years. Natsumi stood on the wooden threshold, hands folded before her apron, watching him with a stillness that came not from distance, but from understanding. He spoke first, voice coarse, as if unused to forming the words he had rehearsed endlessly. "I didn't know if you were alive." Natsumi stepped closer, each footfall quiet on the gravel path. The courtyard behind her was filled with soft sounds, children laughing, a caretaker ringing the dinner bell, birds nesting in the eaves. Life moved around them, unaware that a story interrupted by war had finally reached its last unwritten page. "When the war ended," she said, "many of us disappeared, some into grief, some into rebuilding. I chose the children." He swallowed. "I heard," he whispered. "Kawahara Home for Children. A veteran told me about it. Said a woman saved more lives after the war than she ever could during it." Natsumi bowed her head slightly, acknowledging the kindness without accepting the praise. Smith's eyes drifted across the yard. "So many years," he murmured. "And every one of them, I kept seeing that clearing. The moment He stopped, breath shaking. Natsumi finished the sentence for him, gently. "The moment you tore my shirt." He flinched. The wound had never closed, not really. "I spent decades trying to atone for that," he said. "Some nights, I asked myself if I deserved to. Some nights, I wasn't sure I should keep living." Natsumi stood beside him now, close enough that the silence between them softened. "You bowed," she said quietly. "In Japan, a bow can undo a blade sharper than steel." He looked at her, stunned. "You changed something in me," she continued. "Before that day, I believed everything I was told. That American soldiers would harm us. That you had no mercy. But when you bowed, I realized something else. She paused, searching for the right words. You were human, and so was I. And war tried to strip that away from both of us. Smith's eyes glistened. I hurt you once, he said. You healed so many. Natsumi shook her head. No. We both tried to undo what war forced us to become. For a long moment they stood in silence, listening to the sounds of children, echoes of futures untouched by the blades of nations. She led him inside. The entry hall smelled faintly of tatami mats, miso soup, and the wooden toys children carved during craft hours. Photographs lined the walls, old class pictures, festival days, handprints dipped in red and blue paint. Life documented in small, fragile proofs. Smith moved slowly, as if walking through a museum of lives he never thought he'd witness. Natsumi stopped beside a framed photograph. A group of children huddled around a small sapling planted in the yard during the early years. This is the first tree we planted, she said. The roots never grew straight. The soil was too damaged. But it lived anyway. Smith's voice softened. Like you. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. They continued down the hall to a bench near the courtyard. Smith lowered himself with effort, joints stiff, breath uneven. Natsumi sat beside him, hands folded neatly in her lap. You had a son, he said gently. I remember. The wooden rabbit. Natsumi closed her eyes. Yes. He hesitated. I'm sorry I never asked his name. Taichi, she whispered. Smith repeated the name with care, as if afraid to damage it. Taichi. For a few seconds, neither spoke. He was 7, she continued. On the day of the blast, he was outdoors. They told me he didn't suffer. Smith bowed his head, the old gesture returning instinctively, respect, grief, apology. I know nothing I say can change that, he murmured. Natsumi looked toward the courtyard, where 2 children chased each other around a laundry line. Their laughter drifted on the wind. When I learned he was gone, she said softly, I nearly followed him. But then I remembered something. Something you don't know you gave me. He looked up, waiting. Live, she whispered. A word I had forgotten to choose for myself. Smith pressed his hand to his forehead, not in shame, but in something closer to gratitude. I'm glad you stayed, he said. I'm glad you came, she replied. A caretaker approached with a tray of tea. Natsumi poured for both of them, hands steady, movements precise. Smith watched the ritual with quiet reverence, the way she lifted the kettle, the way steam curled between them like a fragile bridge rebuilt after decades of erosion. Do the children know your story? He asked. No, she said. Not the war. They only know I am here. He nodded. That's enough. A small girl ran past them, wearing wooden clogs far too large for her. She tripped, recovered, and laughed. Smith chuckled under his breath, a sound rusty but sincere. It's strange, he said. I thought coming here would hurt. Instead, it feels like something heavy finally set down. Natsumi looked at him, then at the children playing in the late afternoon sun. Yes, she said. Some burdens only loosen when shared. Smith exhaled slowly, deeply. May I visit again? If it doesn't trouble you. It wouldn't trouble me, she answered. It would honor us. He smiled, small, tentative, but real. The sun lowered over Nagasaki, casting long shadows across the courtyard. 2 elderly figures sat side by side, watching a new generation run freely where destruction once ruled. Not as prisoner and guard, not as victim and offender, but as 2 lives shaped by the same war and healed by different paths. In the fading light, Children's laughter rose like a promise whispered to the city itself. What was broken can be rebuilt. What was lost can be remembered. And what survived can choose what comes next. In war, the enemy is not people, it is war itself. If stories like this matter to you, Sevens, stay with us for the next chapter of history.